The flames crackled in the distance as Sophia Osborne ran toward her family's barn, her heart pounding with fear for the trapped animals inside. The year was 1878, and the Washington Territory was experiencing one of the driest summers in recent memory, perfect conditions for a devastating fire. "Father," Sophia called out, her voice lost in the roar of the spreading blaze. At 22, she had spent her entire life on this homestead outside Seattle, and now she watched in horror as everything threatened to disappear before her eyes. The heat was unbearable as she approached the barn. No one else was in sight. Her father had ridden into town earlier that day, leaving her alone at the homestead. The neighboring ranch hands would be too far to hear her cries. Making a split-second decision, Sophia lifted her skirts and raced toward the barn doors. She had to save the horses, at least. Sophia managed to push one of the heavy doors open just enough to slip inside. The smoke immediately assaulted her lungs, making her cough violently. Through watering eyes, she spotted the terrified horses in their stalls, whinnying and rearing in panic. "Easy, easy," she called, moving toward the first stall where her beloved mare Pepper was frantically pawing at the ground. She had just managed to release Pepper and another horse when a terrible cracking sound came from above. Sophia looked up in horror as a burning beam crashed down, blocking her path to the door. The freed horses bolted past her and out the partially open barn door, which swung shut with a heavy thud behind them. Sophia ran to the door and pushed with all her might, but something on the outside had fallen against it. She was trapped. "Help!" she screamed, the smoke becoming thicker by the second. "Anyone, please help!" The barn was fully ablaze now, flames licking up the walls and dancing along the hayloft. Sophia tore a strip from her petticoat and covered her mouth, crouching low where the air was slightly clearer. She would not die like this, she refused. Minutes passed like hours as she searched frantically for another way out, but the small windows were too high, and the back entrance was already engulfed in flames. The heat was becoming unbearable, her skin blistering from the intensity. Just as Sophia felt her consciousness beginning to slip, she heard a thunderous crash. Through the smoke, she saw the door splinter open and a tall figure silhouetted against the fiery backdrop. "Anyone in here?" a deep voice called out. "Here." Sophia tried to shout, but it came out as barely a whisper. She stumbled toward the voice, her legs weak. The man spotted her and charged through the flames without hesitation. His strong arms wrapped around her waist as he lifted her effortlessly. "I've got you," he said, pulling her against his chest as he turned back toward the door. Another beam crashed down just feet away, sending sparks flying around them. The man shielded her with his body as he navigated through the burning debris. With one powerful kick, he cleared the partially blocked doorway and carried Sophia out into the cool night air. She gulped in deep breaths as he moved them a safe distance from the inferno. When he finally set her down on the soft grass, Sophia got her first clear look at her rescuer. He was a cowboy. That much was obvious from his worn leather chaps and dusty hat. His face was streaked with soot, but she could make out sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw darkened with stubble, and the most intense blue eyes she had ever seen. "Matthew Holloway," he said, his voice rough from the smoke. "You all right, miss?" "Sophia Osborne," she replied, still coughing. "And I am now, thanks to you." Matthew nodded, his eyes reflecting the flames of the barn that was now beyond saving. "Saw the fire from the ridge. My camp's not far." "You saved my life," Sophia said, her voice trembling as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. "Any decent man would have done the same," Matthew replied, though a small smile played at the corner of his lips. "Can you stand?" Sophia nodded and tried to rise, but her legs buckled beneath her. Matthew caught her before she fell, his strong hand steady on her waist. "Easy there," he said, concern evident in his voice. "Breathed in too much smoke, I reckon." As Sophia looked up at the burning barn, her family's livelihood going up in flames, tears filled her eyes. "Everything. It's all gone." Matthew's expression softened. "Not everything," he said quietly. "You're still here." He helped her to a nearby water pump, wetting his bandana and gently wiping the soot from her face. The simple gesture was so tender that Sophia felt a curious flutter in her chest, despite the tragedy surrounding them. "My father will be back from town soon," she said, trying to gather her thoughts. "He'll be devastated." "We should get you somewhere safe," Matthew said, looking toward the horizon. "Fire could spread to the house if the wind shifts." As if on cue, the wind picked up, sending embers dancing through the air toward the main house. Matthew's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation. "We need to protect the house," Sophia insisted, trying again to stand. Matthew nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I'll help. But first, you need water and rest." He led her to the porch of the main house, settling her on a rocking chair before filling a bucket at the pump. He worked tirelessly, soaking the ground between the barn and the house, creating a barrier against the spreading flames. Sophia watched him, this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere to save her. His movements were efficient and purposeful, his broad shoulders flexing with each swing of the bucket. Despite the dire circumstances, she couldn't help but notice how the firelight cast a golden glow on his tanned skin. When her father's wagon finally appeared on the horizon, Matthew was still working to contain the fire. Thomas Osborne's face registered shock and horror as he took in the scene. The barn nearly collapsed in flames, and a stranger moving purposefully around his property. "Sophia!" Thomas called out, leaping from the wagon and rushing to his daughter. "Are you hurt? What happened?" "I'm all right, Father," Sophia assured him, embracing him tightly. "This is Matthew Holloway. He saved my life." Thomas looked over at the cowboy, who had paused in his work, bucket still in hand. "The barn caught fire," Sophia explained. "I was inside trying to free the horses when I got trapped. Mr. Holloway broke down the door and pulled me out." Thomas's expression shifted from suspicion to profound gratitude. He approached Matthew and extended his hand. "I can never repay you for saving my daughter, sir." Matthew accepted the handshake, nodding solemnly. "No need for payment, Mr. Osborne. Just glad I was passing through." As the three of them stood watching the last of the barn succumb to the flames, Sophia couldn't help but wonder about the mysterious cowboy who had appeared exactly when she needed him most. Where had he come from? And perhaps more importantly, where was he going? The fire continued to burn through the night, though they had managed to contain it to the barn. Matthew worked alongside Thomas, ensuring no stray embers threatened the house or the surrounding fields. Sophia, despite her father's insistence that she rest, boiled coffee and prepared food for the men. As dawn broke over the horizon, casting a pink glow across the smoldering ruins, Matthew stood wiping his brow with his bandana. His once clean shirt was now filthy with soot and sweat, but Sophia thought he looked magnificent against the rising sun. "You must stay for breakfast," Thomas insisted, clasping Matthew on the shoulder. "It's the least we can offer." Matthew hesitated, his eyes briefly meeting Sophia's. "I wouldn't want to impose." "Nonsense," Sophia said, finding her voice stronger than she expected. "You've been up all night helping us. Please stay." Something in her tone must have convinced him, for Matthew nodded. "Much obliged." In the kitchen, Sophia worked quickly to prepare a substantial meal. Though the pantry was modest, she had eggs from their chickens, bacon, and fresh bread she had baked just yesterday. As she worked, she found herself glancing out the window to where Matthew was washing up at the pump, his shirt off as he scrubbed the night's grime from his skin. Heat rose to her cheeks, and she quickly turned back to the stove. What was wrong with her? A terrible tragedy had befallen their farm, and here she was, distracted by a stranger's bare chest. Yet when they gathered around the table, Sophia couldn't help but study Matthew more carefully. Now that he was cleaned up, she could see he was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps 26 or 27. His face was handsome in a rugged way, with those striking blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "What brings you to these parts, Mr. Holloway?" Thomas asked between bites of eggs. "Just passing through," Matthew replied, though something in his tone suggested there was more to the story. "Heading north, maybe to the gold fields in British Columbia." "You're a prospector?" Sophia asked, curious. Matthew's mouth quirked in a half-smile that made her heart skip. "Not yet. Been working cattle drives most of my life. Thought it might be time for a change." "Well, the territory could use more good men like you," Thomas said thoughtfully. "We're still building here, especially outside Seattle proper." Sophia noticed a shadow cross Matthew's face at her father's words. There was a story there, she was certain. After breakfast, Matthew insisted on helping assess the damage to the barn. What remained was little more than charred beams and ash, but miraculously, most of the livestock had escaped. The horses Sophia had released were found grazing in the far pasture, and only a few chickens had been lost. "We'll rebuild," Thomas said firmly, surveying the damage. "We've faced worse." Sophia knew he was referring to the death of her mother 5 years prior. The loss had nearly broken them, but they had persevered. The farm had been her mother's dream, and they had continued in her memory. "If you need an extra hand," Matthew offered, "I could delay my journey north." "Least I could do." Thomas looked surprised, then contemplative. "We couldn't pay much. Room and board would suffice," Matthew said, his eyes briefly flicking to Sophia before returning to Thomas. "Been sleeping under the stars for too long anyway." Sophia felt a flutter of excitement at the prospect of Matthew staying. She quickly tamped it down, reminding herself that he was a drifter, a cowboy passing through. It wouldn't do to develop any sort of attachment. "That's mighty generous," Thomas said after a moment. "We'd be grateful for the help, at least until we get the basic structure up again." And just like that, Matthew Holloway became a temporary fixture on the Osborne farm. He moved his few possessions from his campsite to the small cabin near the edge of the property that had once belonged to a hired hand before the economic downturn forced them to let him go. The next few days passed in a flurry of activity. Neighbors from nearby farms came to help clear away the debris from the burned barn, bringing food and supplies. Sophia found herself constantly aware of Matthew's presence as he worked tirelessly alongside the others, his natural leadership emerging as he organized the cleanup efforts. She learned bits and pieces about him in the evenings when he joined them for supper. He was from Texas originally, had been orphaned young, and raised by an uncle who taught him ranching. He'd been drifting northward for several months, taking odd jobs along the way. "Why British Columbia?" she asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Her father had already retired for the night, exhausted from the day's labor. Matthew leaned back in his chair, his profile strong against the fading light. "Heard there's still gold to be found, but mostly it's somewhere new, somewhere I haven't been before." "You don't like staying in one place," Sophia observed. It wasn't a question. Matthew was quiet for a long moment. "Never had much reason to," he finally said, his voice soft. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a current of understanding, perhaps, or something more. Sophia quickly looked away, focusing on the distant mountains. "I've never left Washington," she admitted. "Sometimes I wonder what else is out there." "It's a big world," Matthew said, a smile in his voice, "full of wonders and troubles in equal measure." "And which have you found more of?" she asked. Matthew chuckled, the sound warm in the evening air. "Depends on the day, Miss Osborne." "Sophia," she corrected him. "After pulling someone from a burning building, I think first names are appropriate, don't you?" His smile widened. "Sophia, then." The way he said her name made her heart quicken. Over the next 2 weeks, the framework of a new barn began to take shape. Matthew proved to be skilled with tools, his experience on ranches serving him well. Sophia found herself inventing reasons to be near the construction site, bringing water, delivering messages from her father, offering to help hold boards in place. Each interaction with Matthew left her feeling more drawn to him. He was unlike any man she had met before, quiet but not shy, confident but never boastful, and possessed of a dry wit that often caught her by surprise. She found herself laughing more than she had in years. But she also noticed the restlessness in him, the way his eyes would sometimes scan the horizon as if looking for something or perhaps away from something. Whatever had set him on this nomadic path was still with him, and Sophia knew instinctively that his stay was temporary. The thought brought an unexpected pang of sadness. In such a short time, Matthew had become important to her, though she was careful not to show it too plainly. She had always prided herself on being practical, not given to flights of fancy or romantic notions. Yet she couldn't deny the way her pulse quickened when he was near. One afternoon, as a thunderstorm threatened on the horizon, Sophia found Matthew in the partially constructed barn, securing tarps over the exposed beams. "Father says the storm looks bad," she called over the rising wind. "You should come to the house until it passes." Matthew nodded, tying down the last corner of a tarp. "Be right there, just making sure this won't blow away." As they walked together toward the house, the first heavy raindrops began to fall. By the time they reached the porch, the sky had opened up completely, and they were both soaked through. "That came on fast," Matthew said, running a hand through his wet hair. Sophia couldn't help but laugh at the sight of him, usually so composed, dripping water onto the porch boards. "You look like a half-drowned cat." "And you look like a water nymph," he returned, his eyes crinkling at the corners. The comment caught her off guard, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with exertion. Matthew seemed equally surprised by his own words, an unusual moment of awkwardness passing between them. "Come inside," Sophia said, breaking the silence. "I'll get you a towel." Inside, the house was warm and cozy, the smell of the stew Sophia had left simmering on the stove filling the air. Thomas was in town again, meeting with the banker about a loan to finish the barn construction. "Your father sure trusts me to be here alone with you," Matthew observed as Sophia handed him a towel. She raised an eyebrow. "Should he not?" Matthew met her gaze steadily. "No, he should. I would never dishonor his trust. Or yours." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within her. "I know," she said softly. For a moment they stood there, the rain drumming on the roof above them, creating a world that seemed to contain only the two of them. Sophia was acutely aware of every detail, the way his wet shirt clung to his broad shoulders, the droplet of water tracing a path down his jaw, the intensity in his blue eyes as they held hers. Then a crack of thunder broke the spell, and Sophia stepped back, suddenly aware of how improper the situation might appear to an outsider. "I should check on the stew," she said, turning toward the kitchen. Matthew nodded, running the towel over his hair. "And I should probably change into something dry. I'll be back shortly." As he headed back out into the rain toward his cabin, Sophia leaned against the kitchen counter, her heart racing. What was happening to her? She had known men before there had even been a courtship with the banker's son 2 years ago that had fizzled out without much regret on either side. But this feeling, this awareness of Matthew Holloway, was something entirely different. It was dangerous, she knew. He would leave eventually. Men like him always did. When Matthew returned, wearing dry clothes and with his hair still damp, they ate the stew in comfortable conversation, carefully avoiding any topic that might lead back to the moment they had shared. The storm raged outside, thunder crashing and lightning illuminating the windows, but inside, a different kind of energy crackled between them. Thomas returned just as the storm was abating, soaked and tired but bearing good news about the loan. The three of them celebrated with the apple pie Sophia had baked that morning, and if Thomas noticed the charged atmosphere between his daughter and the cowboy, he gave no indication. That night, lying in bed listening to the receding storm, Sophia made a decision. She would guard her heart carefully. Matthew Holloway might have saved her from the fire, but she would not allow herself to be consumed by a different kind of flame, one that could leave her with nothing but ashes when he inevitably moved on. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed everything clean. Sophia rose early, as was her habit, to prepare breakfast and attend to the chickens. To her surprise, Matthew was already in the yard, splitting firewood. His rhythmic movements were hypnotic, each swing of the axe revealing the strength in his arms and back. "You're up early," she called, approaching with a basket for the eggs. Matthew paused, wiping his brow. "Always have been. Can't seem to sleep past sunrise, no matter how hard I try." "That's a useful trait on a farm," Sophia remarked, then immediately regretted it. She didn't want to give him the impression that she was trying to convince him to stay. If Matthew noticed the implication, he didn't show it. Instead, he smiled and resumed his work. "Figured I'd get a head start before the heat of the day. Your father mentioned wanting to raise the center beam today." "It's good to see the barn taking shape again," Sophia said, watching as more neighbors arrived to help with the day's construction. "Everyone has been so kind." "That's something I've noticed about this place," Matthew said thoughtfully. "There's a real sense of community here. People look out for each other." "Isn't it the same where you're from?" Sophia asked. A shadow crossed Matthew's face. "Not always. I've seen places where people are more likely to take advantage of hardship than help through it." Before Sophia could inquire further, her father emerged from the house, and the conversation turned to the day's work ahead. As the weeks passed and summer began to wane, the new barn neared completion. It was smaller than the original but sturdy and well built. Matthew had proven invaluable, his knowledge of construction surprising both Sophia and her father. One evening, as Sophia was returning from delivering a basket of preserves to an elderly neighbor, she spotted Matthew sitting alone on a fallen log near the edge of the property. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the landscape, and something about his solitary figure against that backdrop made her heart ache. Making a spontaneous decision, she changed direction and approached him. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. Matthew looked up, surprise giving way to a warm smile. "I'd welcome the company." Sophia settled beside him on the log, careful to maintain a proper distance. "It's beautiful here at this time of day." "It is," Matthew agreed, his eyes scanning the rolling hills and distant mountains. "Your family has a fine piece of land." "My mother chose it," Sophia said softly. "She said the first time she saw this valley, she knew it was where she wanted to build a life." Matthew turned to look at her, his expression gentle. "She had good taste, she did." "She would have liked you, I think," Sophia said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I'm honored you'd think so," Matthew replied, his voice low. "From everything you've said about her, she must have been quite a woman." She was, Sophia confirmed, memories washing over her. Strong but gentle, practical but always able to see the beauty in small things. Like mother, like daughter then, Matthew said, his eyes holding hers. The compliment warmed her from within, and for a moment, Sophia allowed herself to imagine what it would be like if Matthew weren't just passing through, if he were considering putting down roots. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. "The barn will be finished soon," she said instead, changing the subject to safer ground. Matthew nodded, turning back to the sunset. Another week, maybe less. The unspoken implication hung between them. Once the barn was done, his reason for staying would be gone. "Have you decided?" Sophia asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "About British Columbia." Matthew was quiet for a long moment. "Not yet," he finally said. "I've been thinking there might be opportunities closer to hand." Hope fluttered in Sophia's chest, but she quickly suppressed it. "The territory is growing rapidly," she agreed. "Seattle will be a proper city before we know it." "It's not just that," Matthew said, his voice taking on a hesitant quality she hadn't heard before. "These past weeks working here, being part of something, it's made me wonder if I've been running towards something or away from it all this time." Sophia turned to look at him, struck by the vulnerability in his expression. "Which is it?" Matthew's eyes met hers, and in them she saw a depth of feeling that took her breath away. "I'm beginning to think I might have been running away from the very thing I've been looking for." Before Sophia could respond, a call came from the direction of the house. Her father was looking for them. Supper was ready. The moment broken, Matthew stood and offered his hand to help her up. When she placed her hand in his, the touch lingered just a second longer than necessary, and Sophia knew that whatever was growing between them could no longer be ignored or denied. As they walked back to the house together, not touching but close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed, Sophia felt as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice. One step could lead to the greatest happiness she had ever known or the most devastating heartbreak. The following days brought a flurry of activity as the barn neared completion. Matthew worked from dawn until dusk, often alongside Thomas and the neighbors who continued to lend their support. Sophia kept everyone fed and watered, her capable hands turning out hearty meals that sustained the workers through their labors. She found herself watching Matthew more often, noticing the easy way he had integrated himself into the community. The initially reserved Cowboy now joked with the neighboring farmers, discussed crop rotation with Thomas, and even entertained the local children with stories of his travels when they came by with their parents. It was as if he belonged here, had always belonged here, and the thought both thrilled and frightened Sophia. She had promised herself she wouldn't develop feelings for this drifter, yet each day made that promise harder to keep. One afternoon, as Matthew was helping her carry baskets of clean laundry from the clothesline, a rider appeared on the road to their farm. The man was unfamiliar, his expensive clothes and well-groomed appearance marking him as a city dweller rather than one of the local farmers. As the stranger approached, Sophia noticed Matthew stiffen beside her, his entire demeanor changing in an instant. "Matthew?" she questioned, concerned by the sudden transformation. "Go inside, Sophia," he said, his voice low and tense. "What is it? Do you know him?" she pressed, not moving. Matthew's jaw tightened. "Please, just go inside." There was something in his tone that compelled her to obey, though reluctantly. She moved to the porch but didn't enter the house, watching as the stranger dismounted and approached Matthew with a cold smile. "Holloway," the man called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still afternoon air. "Fancy finding you playing farmer after all this time." "Wyatt," Matthew acknowledged, his posture rigid. "What are you doing here?" The man named Wyatt chuckled, though the sound held no warmth. Is that any way to greet an old friend? Especially one who's been tracking you for the better part of 3 months. From her position on the porch, Sophia could see the tension in Matthew's shoulders, the way his hand hovered near his hip where a gun would normally be, though he hadn't worn one since arriving at their farm. "We're not friends," Matthew replied evenly. "And if you're here, it's not for a social call." Wyatt's smile faded. "Smart as ever. The boss wants what you took, Holloway. Did you really think you could just disappear?" A chill ran down Sophia's spine. What was this man talking about? What had Matthew taken, and from whom? "I don't have it," Matthew said, his voice hard. "And even if I did, I wouldn't give it to him. You can tell Blackstone I'm done with all of it." The name Blackstone seemed to hang in the air like a dark cloud. Wyatt's expression turned ugly. "Nobody walks away from Blackstone," he warned. "You know that better than most." "I'm not walking away," Matthew replied. "I'm standing my ground, right here." The confrontation was interrupted by Thomas's arrival from the fields. He approached cautiously, taking in the tense scene. "Everything all right here?" he asked, coming to stand beside Matthew in a clear show of support. Wyatt's eyes narrowed as he assessed Thomas, then flicked to Sophia on the porch. A calculating smile spread across his face. "Well, well, I see you found yourself a nice little setup here, Holloway. These good people have no idea who they've welcomed into their home, do they?" "That's enough, Wyatt," Matthew warned, his voice dangerously low. "You have until the end of the week," Wyatt said, mounting his horse again. "Either you bring what you took to the Cascade Hotel in Seattle, or Blackstone will come looking for it himself." His gaze shifted meaningfully to Sophia. "And he'll make sure you regret ever thinking you could start fresh." With that ominous statement hanging in the air, Wyatt wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Thomas turned to Matthew, his expression grave. "I think you have some explaining to do, son." Inside the house, Matthew sat at the kitchen table, his hands clasped tightly before him. Sophia brought coffee, her movements mechanical as her mind raced with questions. Thomas sat across from Matthew, his face unreadable. "I owe you both the truth," Matthew began, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "I didn't just happen to be passing by when the barn caught fire. I was hiding out." "From this Blackstone?" Thomas asked. Matthew nodded. "Calvin Blackstone. He runs most of the illegal operations in Seattle: gambling, protection rackets, smuggling. I worked for him for a time." Sophia felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. "You're a criminal." The words came out more accusatory than she'd intended. Matthew's eyes met hers, and the pain in them was unmistakable. "I was. After drifting north from Texas, I found work hard to come by. Blackstone offered good money for what seemed like simple jobs, at first delivering packages, keeping watch, nothing that appeared overtly illegal. But it didn't stay that way," Thomas guessed. "No," Matthew confirmed. "Before I knew it, I was in deep. I told myself I was just doing what I needed to survive, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "There's no excuse. I became someone I didn't recognize." "What changed?" Sophia asked, finding her voice again. Matthew's expression softened slightly. "I was ordered to burn down a shop that wouldn't pay for protection. The owner lived above it with his family, a wife and 2 small children. I couldn't do it." Thomas leaned forward. "And this thing Wyatt says you took, ledgers," Matthew explained. "When I decided to leave, I took Blackstone's account books as insurance. They detail every illegal transaction, every bribe paid to officials, every name in his pocket. I thought it would keep him from coming after me." "But it's made you an even bigger target," Thomas concluded. Matthew nodded grimly. The ledgers are evidence that could bring down his entire operation. He won't stop until he gets them back. Sophia's mind was reeling. The man she had come to care for, perhaps even love, had been living a lie. Yet the pain and remorse in his eyes seemed genuine. "Where are these ledgers now?" she asked. "Hidden," Matthew replied. "Not on your property," he quickly added, looking at Thomas. "I would never endanger you like that knowingly. They're in a secure location in Seattle." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying Matthew intently. "You've been honest with us now," he finally said. "And you saved my daughter's life. That counts for something." Relief flickered across Matthew's face, but it was short-lived. "However," Thomas continued, "this man Blackstone sounds dangerous. I won't have my daughter or my farm put at risk." "I understand," Matthew said, rising from his chair. "I'll leave immediately. Wyatt knows I'm here now, but if I'm gone, there's no reason for Blackstone to bother you." "Wait," Sophia interjected, surprising herself with the force of her objection. "There must be another solution." Both men turned to look at her, and Sophia felt a surge of determination. She had lost her mother, watched their barn burn, faced countless hardships on the frontier. She would not lose Matthew too, not without a fight. "The law," she said firmly. "If these ledgers are evidence of crimes, why not take them to the authorities?" Matthew's expression turned skeptical. "Blackstone has half the officials in Seattle in his pocket. The few honest ones are too afraid to move against him." "What about federal marshals?" Thomas suggested. "They wouldn't be under Blackstone's influence." A thoughtful look crossed Matthew's face. "I heard a federal marshal arrived in Seattle last month. Been causing trouble for some of the more corrupt elements in the city." "Then that's your answer," Sophia said, hope rising within her. "Go to this marshal, turn over the ledgers, testify against Blackstone." "It's not that simple," Matthew argued. "Blackstone has men everywhere. The moment I show my face in Seattle, word will get back to him." "You won't go alone," Thomas said, his decision apparently made. "We'll go together first thing tomorrow." Matthew looked stunned. "I can't ask you to put yourself in danger for me." "You're not asking," Thomas replied firmly. "I'm offering. And I'm a better shot than I look," he added with a hint of a smile. Sophia felt a rush of pride for her father, but also a stab of fear. "I'm coming too," she declared. "Absolutely not," both men said in unison. "This isn't a debate," Thomas told her. "You'll stay here with Mrs. Peterson from the neighboring farm." Sophia opened her mouth to protest, but the determined look in her father's eyes silenced her. She knew that expression well. There would be no changing his mind. "Fine," she conceded, though her mind was already forming alternate plans. "But promise me you'll both be careful." As the men discussed the details of their journey to Seattle the next day, Sophia moved about the kitchen, preparing dinner with mechanical precision while her thoughts raced. Matthew's revelation had shaken her, but it hadn't changed how she felt about him. If anything, his desire to break away from his criminal past only increased her respect for him. The evening passed in a strange mix of tension and forced normalcy. After dinner, Thomas excused himself to prepare for the journey, leaving Sophia and Matthew alone in awkward silence. "I never wanted to bring this trouble to your door," Matthew finally said, his voice low. "Your family has been nothing but good to me, and this is how I repay you." "You saved my life," Sophia reminded him. "And you've worked harder than anyone to rebuild our barn. One mistake, even a big one, doesn't define who you are." Matthew looked at her with a mixture of wonder and sadness. "You have more faith in me than I deserve." "Perhaps," Sophia acknowledged, "or perhaps I see who you truly are beneath the mistakes and the regrets." He stepped closer to her then, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "And who is that?" Sophia held his gaze steadily. "A good man trying to find his way home." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither of them was ready to fully acknowledge. For a moment, Sophia thought Matthew might close the distance between them, might take her in his arms as he had that night of the fire. Instead, he stepped back, respect and regret warring in his eyes. "Thank you," he said softly, "for seeing something in me worth believing in." With that, he bid her good night and left for his cabin, leaving Sophia standing alone in the kitchen, her heart heavy with unspoken words. Dawn broke clear and cool the next morning. Thomas and Matthew prepared to depart, loading supplies onto Thomas's wagon. They would take the main road to Seattle, a journey of several hours, with the plan to seek out the federal marshal immediately upon arrival. Sophia had risen early to prepare food for their journey and to say her goodbyes. Mrs. Peterson, a kindly widow from the neighboring farm, had arrived to stay with her, bringing her knitting and cheerful conversation that Sophia could barely focus on. As the men finished their preparations, Sophia stepped outside to see them off. Thomas embraced her tightly. "We'll be back by tomorrow evening at the latest," he assured her. "Don't worry." "Be safe," Sophia replied, hugging him back. Then it was Matthew's turn to say goodbye. He approached her somewhat awkwardly, clearly unsure of the proper protocol given their complicated relationship. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." Impulsively, Sophia reached up and straightened his collar, her fingers lingering perhaps a moment too long. "Come back safely," she told him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Both of you." Something flickered in Matthew's eyes, a promise, perhaps, or a hope for the future. He nodded, then followed Thomas to the wagon. As she watched them drive away, Sophia felt a growing unease. The thought of Matthew confronting the dangerous Blackstone, even with the law on his side, filled her with dread. What if something went wrong? What if the marshal was one of those in Blackstone's pocket by midday? Sophia could no longer bear the waiting and worrying. Despite her promise to stay at the farm, she made a decision. After ensuring Mrs. Peterson was comfortably settled with her knitting and a pot of tea, Sophia slipped out to the stable where her mare Pepper was kept. "I need to run an errand in town," she told Mrs. Peterson vaguely when the older woman questioned her preparations. "I won't be long." Before the kindly widow could object, Sophia was mounted and heading down the road toward Seattle, her heart pounding with determination and fear in equal measure. The journey to Seattle was tense but uneventful. Matthew sat beside Thomas on the wagon bench, scanning the road ahead and behind for any signs of Blackstone's men. They spoke little, but the silence was companionable rather than awkward. As they approached the outskirts of the growing city, Matthew directed Thomas to a small, nondescript boarding house where he had stayed before working for Blackstone. "The owner, Mrs. Chen, is trustworthy," he explained. "She doesn't ask questions, and she keeps her place clean and respectable." Thomas nodded, guiding the wagon through the increasingly crowded streets. Seattle was booming, with new buildings going up on nearly every block. The smell of sawdust mixed with the salty air from the harbor, and the sounds of construction competed with the calls of street vendors and the chatter of pedestrians. They secured a room at the boarding house, where Matthew was greeted warmly by Mrs. Chen, a small, dignified woman who seemed genuinely pleased to see him again. After refreshing themselves, they set out to find the federal marshal's office. "It should be near the courthouse," Matthew said as they walked through the bustling streets. He kept his hat pulled low, eyes constantly scanning for familiar faces. The marshal's office was indeed near the courthouse, a small, unassuming building with a simple sign declaring it the office of the United States Marshal. A young deputy was seated at a desk inside, looking bored until they entered. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, straightening up. "We need to speak with Marshal Davis," Matthew said. "It's a matter of some urgency." The deputy eyed them skeptically. "Marshall's busy. What's this about?" Thomas stepped forward, his bearing dignified and commanding. "Young man, we have information regarding criminal activities in this city that the marshal will want to hear. It involves a man named Calvin Blackstone." At the mention of Blackstone, the deputy's expression changed subtly. "Wait here," he said, rising and disappearing through a door at the back of the office. "You think he's one of Blackstone's men?" Thomas murmured to Matthew. "Hard to say," Matthew replied quietly, "but we'll know soon enough by the marshal's reaction." A moment later, the door opened again, and a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a neatly trimmed beard emerged. He wore a marshal's badge prominently on his vest and carried himself with the confident air of a man accustomed to authority. "I'm Marshal James Davis," he introduced himself, his shrewd eyes taking in the two men before him. "I understand you have information about Calvin Blackstone." There was no hint of corruption in his direct gaze, but Matthew remained cautious. "Could we speak somewhere more private, Marshal?" Davis considered this request, then nodded. "My office," he said, gesturing them through the door he had just exited. Once inside the small but orderly office with the door firmly closed, Matthew began his story. He told Davis everything: how he had started working for Blackstone, the increasingly illegal activities he had been drawn into, his decision to leave, and the ledgers he had taken as insurance. The marshal listened without interruption, his expression giving nothing away. When Matthew finished, Davis leaned back in his chair, studying him intently. "You understand that you're admitting to criminal activity," he said evenly. "You could face charges yourself." "I know," Matthew replied, meeting the marshal's gaze squarely. "I'm prepared to face the consequences of my actions, but Blackstone needs to be stopped before more people get hurt." Davis nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer. "And these ledgers, you have them somewhere safe?" "Yes, sir," Matthew confirmed. "Hidden where only I can find them." "Good," Davis said. "Because if Blackstone gets his hands on them first, they'll disappear forever, along with any chance of bringing him to justice." "What do you need from us, Marshal?" Thomas asked. Davis considered for a moment. "I need those ledgers, and I need Mr. Holloway's testimony. But this has to be done carefully. Blackstone does indeed have men throughout the city, including within the local law enforcement. He's given me until the end of the week to return the ledgers," Matthew explained. "He sent a man named Wyatt to deliver the message." Recognition flashed in Davis's eyes. "Wyatt Pierce, one of Blackstone's most trusted enforcers. If he tracked you down, Blackstone won't be far behind." The marshal rose and began pacing, his mind clearly working through the problem. "Here's what we'll do," he finally said. "You'll retrieve the ledgers tonight after dark. Bring them directly to me, not here but at my home." He wrote down an address on a slip of paper. "I'll arrange for federal protection for you until the trial." "And my farm?" Thomas asked. "My daughter is there alone." Davis frowned. "If Blackstone knows where Mr. Holloway has been staying, he might send men there as leverage." Matthew's blood ran cold at the thought of Sophia in danger. "We need to go back," he said urgently. "Now." "I'll send 2 of my deputies with you," Davis decided. "Men I trust completely. They'll help secure your farm while we prepare to move against Blackstone." As they finalized the details with Marshal Davis, Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. Blackstone moved quickly when his interests were threatened, and Sophia was alone with only Mrs. Peterson for company. Meanwhile, Sophia had arrived in Seattle, her determination carrying her through the unfamiliar streets. She had been to the city only a handful of times, always with her father, and never alone. The noise and bustle were overwhelming after the quiet of their farm, but she pressed on, asking directions to the federal marshal's office. As she neared her destination, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck made her turn. A man was watching her from across the street, a tall, thin figure with a cold smile that sent shivers down her spine. Somehow, she knew instantly that this was one of Blackstone's men. Sophia quickened her pace, weaving through the crowded sidewalk. When she glanced back again, the man was following her, his movements casual but purposeful. Panic rose in her throat as she realized she had made a terrible mistake in coming to Seattle alone. Spotting an alleyway between two buildings, Sophia ducked into it, hoping to lose her pursuer. The alley was narrow and dim, smelling of garbage and stale beer. She hurried forward, only to find her path blocked by a wooden fence too high to climb. Before she could turn back, a voice came from behind her. "Miss Osborne, I presume." The man from the street stood at the alley entrance, effectively trapping her. "Mr. Blackstone would very much like to speak with you." Sophia's heart hammered in her chest, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "I have nothing to say to Mr. Blackstone." The man chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. "Oh, I think you do, especially if you want to see your father and that traitor Holloway again." Cold dread washed over her. "What have you done to them?" "Nothing yet," the man replied, advancing slowly. "But their continued good health depends entirely on how cooperative you're willing to be." Sophia backed away until she felt the fence against her back. She looked frantically for a weapon, anything she could use to defend herself, but found nothing. "You're making a mistake," she warned, trying to keep her voice steady. "The federal marshal already knows everything about Blackstone." A flicker of uncertainty crossed the man's face, but it was quickly replaced with skepticism. "A desperate lie," he said, "but it doesn't matter. You're coming with me either way." As he reached for her arm, Sophia made a split-second decision. She ducked under his outstretched hand and drove her knee upward with all her strength, catching him in a vulnerable spot. The man doubled over with a howl of pain, and Sophia bolted past him, back toward the crowded street. She had nearly reached the alley entrance when rough hands grabbed her from behind, clamping over her mouth to stifle her screams. A second man had appeared, this one burlier than the first. "That wasn't very ladylike," he growled in her ear as he dragged her backward. "Mr. Blackstone doesn't like it when people make things difficult." Sophia struggled, but the man's grip was like iron. She watched in despair as the first man straightened, his face contorted with rage and pain. "You'll pay for that," he promised, approaching her with menace in every step. Just as he raised his hand to strike her, a commanding voice rang out from the alley entrance. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Sophia's head whipped around to see Matthew standing there, a revolver trained steadily on her captors. Beside him was a man wearing a marshal's badge, his own weapon drawn. "Federal Marshal," the second man announced. "Release the lady immediately." The burly man hesitated, then slowly loosened his grip on Sophia. She tore away from him, running straight into Matthew's outstretched arm. He pulled her behind him protectively, never lowering his weapon. "Pierce," the marshal addressed the thin man who had first pursued Sophia. "This adds kidnapping to your growing list of charges. Not smart." Wyatt Pierce, for it was indeed the same man who had confronted Matthew at the farm, sneered. "You've got nothing on me, Davis, and Blackstone will have both of you dead by morning." "I don't think so," Marshal Davis replied calmly. "Not with those ledgers in federal custody and a dozen witnesses ready to testify against him, including Mr. Holloway here." Uncertainty flickered across Pierce's face. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Davis smiled coldly. "Federal agents are moving on Blackstone's operation as we speak." "It's over, Pierce." For a tense moment, it seemed Wyatt might try something desperate. Then his shoulders slumped in defeat. The marshal quickly moved in to handcuff both men, reading them their rights as he did so. Only when the prisoners were secured did Matthew holster his weapon and turn to Sophia, his face a mixture of relief and anger. "What were you thinking?" he demanded, gripping her shoulders. "You could have been killed." "I was worried about you," Sophia replied, her voice shaking slightly. "About both of you. Where's my father? He's safe," Matthew assured her, his expression softening. "He's with Deputy Marshal Thompson at our boarding house. We were on our way to retrieve the ledgers when we spotted you being followed." Sophia sagged against him, the adrenaline of her ordeal beginning to ebb. "I'm sorry, I thought I could help." Matthew's arms went around her, holding her close. "You stubborn, brave, foolish woman," he murmured into her hair. "Don't you ever scare me like that again." Marshal Davis cleared his throat, reminding them of his presence. "We should move quickly," he said. "These two aren't Blackstone's only men in the city." Matthew nodded, reluctantly releasing Sophia but keeping a protective hand at the small of her back. "The ledgers are hidden in a loose floorboard at my old room at the Empire Hotel, not far from here." "Let's go," Davis said, handing his prisoners off to another deputy who had arrived at the scene. "Miss Osborne, I insist you stay with your father while we retrieve the evidence." "No," Sophia said firmly. "I'm not letting Matthew out of my sight again." Matthew looked as though he might argue, but something in her expression stopped him. "Fine," he conceded, "but you stay between us at all times and you do exactly as we say." The retrieval of the ledgers went smoothly. The Empire Hotel was a run-down establishment in a seedier part of town, but the desk clerk recognized Matthew and let them pass without question. In a small, dusty room on the third floor, Matthew prized up a floorboard to reveal a waterproof packet containing several leather-bound books. These detail every transaction, every bribe, every illegal operation Blackstone has run for the past 5 years, Matthew explained as he handed them to Marshal Davis. "Names, dates, amounts, it's all there." Davis leafed through the pages, his expression grim but satisfied. "This is more than enough to put him away for life," he confirmed, "and to bring down several corrupt officials with him." They returned to the boarding house where Thomas was waiting anxiously. His relief at seeing Sophia was palpable, though it quickly turned to exasperation when he learned of her reckless journey into the city. "We'll discuss this when we get home," he told her, in a tone that brooked no argument. That evening, they gathered in Marshal Davis's home, a modest but comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood. The marshal explained that federal agents had already arrested Blackstone at his club in Seattle, along with several of his top lieutenants. "He'll face trial within the month," Davis assured them. "With the ledgers and Mr. Holloway's testimony, there's no way he'll escape conviction." "And what about Matthew?" Sophia asked, the question that had been weighing on her mind finally voiced. "You said he admitted to criminal activities." Davis nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's true, but his cooperation has been invaluable, and he clearly sought to turn his life around before any of this came to a head." He looked at Matthew directly. "I'm prepared to recommend leniency in exchange for your full testimony against Blackstone and his organization." Relief flooded through Sophia. Matthew wouldn't go to prison. He would be free to choose his own path forward. That path became clearer the next morning as they prepared to return to the farm. With Blackstone in custody and the immediate danger past, a new question hung between Matthew and Sophia: what would happen now? As Thomas loaded the wagon, Matthew took Sophia aside, his expression serious. "I need to stay in Seattle for a time," he said, "to give my testimony and help the marshal tie up loose ends, but after that, He paused, seeming to search for the right words. After that, you'll continue north to British Columbia. Sophia asked, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. Matthew shook his head, a smile slowly spreading across his face. No. After that, I was hoping I might come back to the farm, if your father would have me as a hired hand, if you would want me to return. Hope blossomed in Sophia's chest. I would, she said simply. Very much. Matthew took her hand then, his touch gentle but sure. These past weeks, working alongside you and your father, I've felt something I haven't felt since I was a boy, like I belonged somewhere, like I had a home. You do, Sophia told him, squeezing his hand. If you want it to be. I do, he replied, his voice husky with emotion. But I need to do things right. I need to clear my name, make amends for my past. And then, if you'll still have me, I want to court you properly. Sophia Osborne. Joy welled up within her, so intense it was almost painful. I'll be waiting, she promised. They parted with that promise hanging between them, not a goodbye, but a beginning. As Sophia and Thomas headed back to their farm, she felt lighter than she had in years, her heart full of hope for the future. The weeks that followed were busy ones. Sophia and Thomas completed the barn with the help of their neighbors, the new structure rising strong and secure where the old one had burned. Life returned to its normal rhythms of planting, harvesting, and tending to the livestock. But for Sophia, every day was brightened by letters from Seattle. Matthew wrote regularly, describing the progress of the case against Blackstone. The trial had begun, and his testimony had been well received by the judge and jury. Marshal Davis had kept his word about recommending leniency, and it seemed likely that Matthew would face no charges himself due to his cooperation. In his letters, Matthew also shared his hopes and dreams for the future, dreams that increasingly centered around the Osborne farm and, more specifically, around Sophia herself. His words were careful but heartfelt, painting a picture of the life they might build together. Sophia kept each letter, rereading them in the quiet evenings by lamplight, her heart growing more certain with each passing day that Matthew Holloway was the man she wanted to spend her life with. It was a crisp autumn day when the familiar figure appeared on the road leading to the farm. Sophia was in the garden, harvesting the last of the season's vegetables, when she spotted him, tall and straight-backed on his horse, his hat pulled low against the late afternoon sun. She stood, brushing soil from her hands, her heart racing as Matthew approached. He dismounted smoothly, leading his horse the last few yards until he stood before her, a smile breaking across his face. "You came back," Sophia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I promised I would," Matthew replied, his blue eyes warm with affection. For a moment, they simply stood looking at each other, drinking in the sight after so many weeks apart. Then, with a step that seemed to bridge more than just physical distance, Matthew was before her, taking her hands in his. "Blackstone has been sentenced," he told her. 20 years in prison. His organization is dismantled, his corrupt officials exposed and removed from office. "And you?" Sophia asked, searching his face. Matthew's smile widened. "Free and clear. Marshal Davis kept his word. My testimony was deemed valuable enough to warrant full immunity." Joy bubbled up within Sophia, and she couldn't stop herself from throwing her arms around him. Matthew caught her, his embrace strong and sure, lifting her slightly off her feet in his enthusiasm. When he set her down, his expression had grown serious again. "I spoke with your father before I left Seattle," he said. "Asked his permission to court you properly." Sophia's breath caught. "And what did he say?" "He said that any man who would run into a burning barn to save his daughter had already proven his worth," Matthew replied, a hint of humor in his voice. But he also made it clear that his blessing depends on my intentions being honorable and my future plans being stable. And are they? Sophia asked, her heart in her throat. Matthew nodded, his gaze steady and sure. Marshall Davis has offered me a position as a deputy. It would mean living in Seattle, but it's honest work, using my knowledge of the criminal world for good. Sophia felt a flicker of disappointment. You'd live in the city then? That's one option, Matthew acknowledged. But I told him I needed to discuss it with you first, because there's another path I'm considering. What's that? Sophia asked, hope rising once more. Your father mentioned that with the barn rebuilt, he's been thinking of expanding, adding more livestock, perhaps growing the farm. He said he could use a partner, someone with strong arms and a good head for business. Matthew's eyes held hers, full of hope and possibility. Someone who might one day inherit the farm alongside his daughter. Tears of happiness sprang to Sophia's eyes. And what did you say to that? I said it sounded like exactly the future I've been searching for, Matthew replied softly. If you'll have me. In answer, Sophia rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened as Matthew's arms went around her, pulling her close. It was a promise, a beginning, a homecoming. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and smiling, the setting sun cast a golden glow across their land, where a future stretched before them as vast and promising as the western sky. In the months that followed, Matthew proved himself an invaluable partner in the farm's operations. His strength and work ethic impressed even the neighboring farmers who had initially been skeptical of the former cowboy with the mysterious past. Under his and Thomas's combined efforts, the Osborne farm began to flourish as never before. Matthew and Sophia's courtship progressed with proper decorum but undeniable passion. Their shared experience of danger had forged a bond between them that only grew stronger with each passing day. They discovered in each other not just romantic love, but a true partnership, Sophia's practical intelligence complementing Matthew's bold vision, his strength supporting her gentleness. By the following spring, with the apple trees in bloom and new life emerging across the farm, Matthew asked Sophia to be his wife. He proposed in the very spot where the old barn had burned, where he had carried her from the flames, and into a love neither of them had expected to find. Their wedding was a joyous affair, attended by the entire community that had embraced Matthew as one of their own. Marshall Davis came from Seattle to stand as Matthew's best man, a symbol of the bridges between his past and his future. Even Mrs. Chen made the journey from her boarding house, bringing exotic spices and silks as a wedding gift. As Sophia and Matthew exchanged their vows beneath an arch of spring flowers, she thought of how far they had come from that terrifying night of the fire, how what had seemed like an ending had actually been the beginning of everything. That night, as Matthew carried his bride across the threshold of their home, a new cabin they had built on the Osborne property, Sophia knew she had found the happiness her mother had wished for her. Not a life without hardship or challenges, but one rich with love, purpose, and the promise of tomorrow. And in the years that followed, as children came to bless their union, first a son with his father's blue eyes, then twin daughters with their mother's quiet strength, the story of how they met became family legend. How a barn fire had brought a drifting cowboy and a farmer's daughter together. How he had broken down the door and carried her to safety. How they had saved each other in all the ways that mattered. On warm summer evenings, they would sit on the porch of the farmhouse that was now theirs, Thomas, having moved to a smaller cottage on the property, where he enjoyed his role as doting grandfather, and watch the sun set over the land they had built together. Matthew's hand would find Sophia's, their fingers intertwining with the comfortable familiarity of long-held love. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if you hadn't been passing by that night?" Sophia would sometimes ask. "If you hadn't seen the fire?" And Matthew would always answer the same way, his eyes filled with certainty and gratitude. "It wasn't chance that brought me here, Sophia. It was where I was always meant to be." In those moments, with the distant mountains painted gold and purple in the fading light, with their children's laughter carrying on the evening breeze, Sophia knew it was true. From the ashes of that burning barn, they had built not just a home or a family, but a love that would endure long after the last ember had cooled, a love as vast and endless as the western sky above them.